I think it's worth to have a cost of, unfortunately, some gun deaths every single year.
I can't stand the word empathy, actually. I think empathy is a made-up New Age term that it does a lot of damage. Death penalty should be public, it should be quick, it should be televised.
Charlie Kirk was shot and killed while debating with a student on a college campus. A man whose career was built on free expression, the right to stand up, the right to speak, and the right to be challenged, was gunned down in the middle of exercising it. And here's the shocking part. People celebrated.
I, on the other hand, do cheer when bad things happen to bad people.
Charlie Kirk just got shot.
I'm not saying she deserved it, but I'm saying God's timing is always right.
Not just anonymous trolls, but respected figures. The incoming president of the Oxford Union, one of the most prestigious and historic societies in the world, posted laughing emojis and said,
Charlie Kirk got shot, let's effing go.
Charlie Kirk was divisive. To many, he spread hate speech, stigmatizing entire groups and denying them equal standing. But to his supporters, Kirk was a defender of the principle that even offensive speech deserves a platform. His death and the reaction to it tells us something bigger. It's not just about one man, it's about the freedom of speech itself. Because when words start to get you killed, when societies stop distinguishing between debate and elimination, democracy itself is in real danger. That's what this video is about. We're going to take a deep dive into the philosophy, the psychology, and the politics of free speech. I want you to understand this topic so deeply that you can easily explain it to your friends, to your family, and to your colleagues. So stick with me to the end and even grab a notepad and pen, because this one matters.
I mean, Joe Biden is a bumbling, corrupt tyrant who should be put in prison and or given the death penalty for his crimes against America. You're gonna remove my appendix and you're a black lesbian.
Birth control really screws up female brains, by the way. Joy Reid and Michelle Obama and Sheila Jackson Lee and Ketanji Brown Jackson, they're coming out and they're saying, I'm only here because of affirmative action. Yeah, we know. You do not have the brain processing power to otherwise be taken really seriously.
When you see a black pilot, you wonder, you say, I hope they are qualified.
I live like a capitalist every single day, Shank. I live as a capitalist, okay? I live when I believe.
I can name at least a dozen people more deserving in the 20th century of a federal holiday than MLK. I can say declaratively, this guy is not worthy of a national holiday. He is not worthy of godlike status. In fact, I think it's really hard.
Hey, if you're new here, my name's Dr. Vinay Raniga, a former political leadership scholar at the University of Oxford. Please, please, please hit that subscribe button right now so we can continue to make new original content just like this. Let's dive in. So here's a roadmap. First, we'll look at why free speech is considered the cornerstone of democracy through thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Spinoza. Then, we'll dive into the psychology of free speech, why talking and thinking are inseparable. Third, we'll tackle the toughest question. Where's the line between free speech and hate speech? That's where we'll bring in Parek's theory and the harm principle. Then, we'll look at cancel culture. I know many of you have been talking about that in my comments, and non-governmental censorship. The ways we silence each other outside of the law, from campuses to social media. And finally, we'll come back to why free speech matters and why Charlie Kirk's death is a warning to us all. This is going to be both story and a deep dive, because free speech isn't just another issue. It's the foundation of democracy, the fuel of progress, and the way we define who we are.
I will also sign an executive order to immediately stop all government censorship and bring back free speech to America.
Let's start with the foundations. Why do we call free speech the cornerstone of democracy? What makes it so special compared to other rights? To answer that, we need to go back to three major voices: John Stuart Mill, Spinoza, and the framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, published in 1859, is still the most famous defense of free expression. Mill makes 4 arguments that are as relevant today as they were 150 years ago. First, he says humans make mistakes. We are not always right. Silencing an opinion assumes that we have perfect knowledge, and that assumption is almost always wrong. The suppressed idea might actually be true, and if we silence it, we rob everyone the chance to correct themselves. Secondly, even false opinions usually contain fragments of truth. Very rarely is one side 100% right and the other 100% wrong. By allowing debate, we pull kernels of truth out of even mistaken or unpopular positions. Thirdly, Mill warns that truth must be contested to stay alive. If dissent is not allowed, then even the truest beliefs eventually become dead dogmas. People stop understanding why they believe something. For beliefs to remain living truths, they must be contested and challenged regularly. Fourth, he argues that debate improves society and policy. When we engage with opposing views, we sharpen our own thinking, overcome our biases, and create strong institutions. It's through argument democracy becomes smarter, not dumber. And he leaves us with this striking warning. Listen to this. He says, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he would be justified in silencing mankind. 2 centuries earlier, Spinoza had made a claim that was radical for his own time. In his work in 1670, he declared, "In a free state, every man may think what he likes and say what he thinks." For Spinoza, freedom of expression wasn't something granted by kings or parliaments. It was natural. You cannot force people not to think, and trying to suppress thought or speech is both impossible and part of tyranny. He argued that governments may control actions, but never minds. Any regime that tries to dictate what people must believe is illegitimate. And then, after the horrors of World War II, these insights were written into international law. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." This was a direct response to the totalitarian regimes where censorship and propaganda had paved the way for atrocities. The lesson was clear. Without free speech, democracy collapses, truth withers, and tyranny thrives. But not all traditions treat speech as an absolute. In Confucian political philosophy, authority is justified only if it serves the people's welfare, what some scholars call the service conception of authority. Here, free expression is not a right in itself, it's justified only insofar that it contributes to harmony and virtue. If speech undermines order or corrupt morality, it may legitimately be restricted. So this contrast matters. In liberal democracies, speech is an end in itself. In Confucian traditions, it is instrumental, conditional on the common good. So here's the big takeaway for chapter 1. For Mill, Spinoza, and the framers of the UDHR, free speech is fundamental because it allows for truth to emerge, errors to be corrected, and citizens to govern themselves. Without it, democracy simply isn't possible. Charlie Kirk believed this too, that universities should be the marketplaces of ideas. You should be able to pick and choose between ideas. But in today's polarized climate, that very belief made him controversial and ultimately a target. Freedom of speech isn't just about constitutions and laws, it's about psychology, about how humans actually think. And here's a key insight: talking and thinking are inseparable. Even Jordan Peterson puts it bluntly: in order to think, you must risk being offensive.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on. So and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did.
Thought itself emerges through dialogue. None of us think in perfect, polished sentences inside our heads. We articulate ideas out loud, we test them, and then we refine them. If you can't risk offending someone, you can't really test your ideas honestly. You censor yourself before you've even thought them through. Timothy Garton Ash, in his book Free Speech: 10 Principles for a Connected World, takes this even further. He writes, free expression is how we realize our full individual humanity. In other words, speech isn't just about how we communicate ideas that we already have, it's how we discover who we are. If you're forced into silence, you are prevented from fully becoming yourself. Suppressing speech doesn't just stop at words, it causes cognitive harm. It stunts intellectual growth, and people start to live double lives, outward conformity and inward resentment. That creates mistrust, anxiety, and alienation. In repressive societies, people often describe it as suffocating, like they literally can't breathe. And sociologist Gillian Valentine warns of another danger. Banning hate speech doesn't end hate. It simply privatizes it. Suppressed groups retreat underground into spaces where they can radicalize further and bond over their sense of persecution. That's exactly why John Stuart Mill insisted that evil doctrines should be confronted openly, not forced underground. Otherwise, they gain strength in the shadows. Charlie Kirk's death illustrates this psychology perfectly. Silencing him didn't end his ideas, it made him a martyr. He gained 6 million Instagram followers overnight. His supporters can now point and say, look, they had to kill him to stop him. That's exactly the dynamic Mill, Valentine, and Peterson warns us about. Suppression strengthens what it tries to erase. Now let's turn to one of the hardest debates in philosophy and politics. Where do we draw the line? What's free speech and what's hate speech?
He did not hate his opponents. He wanted the best for them. That's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent, and I don't want the best for them. I'm sorry.
Philosopher Bhikkhu Parekh defines hate speech with 3 elements. First, it's targeted, directed against specific people or groups based on arbitrary traits like race, religion, gender, or sexuality. Second, it's stigmatizing. It ascribes highly undesirable qualities to them: criminal, subhuman, dangerous. And third, it's delegitimizing. It portrays them as outsiders, as legitimate objects of hostility, exclusion, or even extermination. Notice, Parekh's definition doesn't require an explicit call to violence. The harm lies in degrading equal standing in society. Mill, however, gave us a more practical test, the harm principle. He said that liberty can only be restricted to prevent harm to others. His famous example is writing corn dealers starve the poor in a pamphlet is fine. Shouting it outside a corn dealer's house to an angry mob is not. The difference is whether speech directly and imminently provokes physical violence. The law reflects these different approaches. In the United States, hate speech is largely protected unless it crosses into direct incitement. But in Germany, Canada, and India, hate speech laws criminalize speech that undermines dignity, spreads hostility, or incites hatred. These differences show contrasting values. America prioritizes liberty, while others prioritize equality and dignity. Let's apply this to real-world examples. In 2022, President Biden called MAGA Republicans a threat to democracy, even semi-fascist.
MAGA Republicans are a threat to our very democracy. This MAGA threat is a threat to the brick and mortar of our democratic institutions. But it's also a threat to the character of our nation that gives our Constitution life. That is a threat to this country.
That's strong language, but it's political speech. It targets an ideology, not a race or religion. One could argue it doesn't cross into a direct call to violence. Charlie Kirk mocked school shootings as a cost to freedom and stigmatized LGBTQ people. By Parekh's definition, only Charlie Kirk's comments arguably count as hate speech. They target groups, stigmatize them, and delegitimize their place in society. Now, you may not agree with that definition because it's really hard to say who should make that decision or where the line is. Because here's the paradox. Both sides say the other is an existential threat. Biden says Trumpism endangers democracy. Kirk says progressives endanger freedom. At what point do these claims move from debate to incitement? And when does rhetoric radicalize? Charlie Kirk's death suggests that we're already living in this very dangerous gray zone.
shockwaves across Hollywood tonight after ABC announced it was indefinitely pulling Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air.
Free speech isn't only threatened by governments. Increasingly, it's threatened by us. My professor at Oxford called these extra-legal restrictions. They include no platforming, denying people a forum.
That's some people's job nowadays, is to complain and be heard and be offended and try to get things cancelled.
Social exclusion, ostracizing or shaming them, viewpoint discrimination, media outlets or employers deciding some ideas can't be voiced. Think of what happened to Jimmy Kimmel recently. But perhaps most powerful of all is self-censorship, when people bite their own tongues out of fear of the consequences of speaking up. George Lukianoff, in his book Unlearning Liberty, documents cases of campus censorship. Students stealing or burning entire runs of campus newspapers because they didn't like an article. Administrations often look the other way, treating it as protest rather than censorship. Lukianoff calls this mob censorship, and it's shockingly common across the Western world.
Student journalist Tim Tye was covering the MU demonstrations on Tuesday when protesters and professors demanded he leave. They formed a line and blocked Tye when he tried to take pictures at a public area on campus.
Physically intimidating people who have the right to be there.
There's a publication called the Wesleyan Argus, publishes twice a week. They had an op-ed critical of the Black Lives Matter movement.
One could argue that the irony is that after Kirk's death, conservatives who had long attacked cancel culture began doing it themselves. You may not agree with this point, but teachers, journalists, and even office staff who mocked him were fired or disciplined.
To the person that sent that video to corporate and got me fired, thank you. I just got fired.
What the you're supposed to do when you get fired? You just take it? You just take it like a man?
Teachers being fired over personal social media posts about Charlie Kirk. States like Florida and Texas even setting up hotlines to report teachers. That's not education policy. That's a witch hunt.
The very same cancel culture they denounced was suddenly used as a weapon by their own side. This shows that cancel culture isn't just left or right, it's cultural impulse. But let's take this back a step. Of course, it was so disturbing to see people celebrate another human's death. A political assassination. And employers have the right of freedom of association to disassociate themselves with people celebrating death. Would you want your kids being taught by a teacher who celebrates death? Would you want to work with other people who laugh at someone being harmed? So there's a balance there between freedom of speech and right of association. But the point still stands. It's a cultural impulse. It's a human tendency to silence those who offend us. And that's the real danger. If society itself rejects the principle of free speech, laws won't save it. If people genuinely believe that silencing opponents is virtuous, then democracy rots from within.
My starting point when it comes to the consideration of any issue relating to free speech is my passionate belief that the second most precious thing in life is the right to express yourself freely. The most precious thing in life, I think, is food in your mouth, and the third most precious is a roof over your head. But a fixture for me in the number 2 slot is free expression, just below the need to sustain life itself.
So let's bring this all together. Why defend free speech when it's so messy, so offensive, and sometimes even harmful? There are 3 big reasons. First, truth and progress. Mill argued that truth only stays alive through contest. Every moral advance, from the abolition of slavery to women's suffrage to civil rights, began with unpopular speech. If these voices had been silenced, progress would have been impossible. Second is human dignity. Garton Ash says that free expression is how we realize our full humanity. To speak is to be. Suppressing speech is not just silencing words, it's denying someone's full personhood. Third is democratic stability. Mill warned that without open debate, grievances don't disappear. They fester underground until they explode into violence. Free speech is the safety valve of democracy. It's how societies release pressure peacefully instead of through bullets and bombs. And that brings us back to Charlie Kirk. His death is proof of what happens when speech itself is treated as violence. Actual violence follows. And when people cheer that violence, it shows how far we've drifted from Mill's vision of a society where even the worst ideas should be challenged, not crushed. Free speech is not just one right among many. It's the foundation that makes all others possible. Without it, there's no democracy, there's no progress. It's what makes us human. Charlie Kirk's death is a tipping point. It's more than just a story of one man and one tragic moment on a university campus. It's a case study in what happens when free expression no longer is seen as a shared foundation, but as a battleground where enemies must be destroyed. Think about it. The campus debate, the jeers online, the Oxford Union president-elect celebrating, the calls to punish those who cheered.
So when you see someone celebrating Charlie's murder, call them out. And hell, call their employer.
The debates about whether Charlie himself had crossed the line into hate speech. All of this tells us something about where as a society we are. We're no longer just debating ideas. We're debating where the debate itself is legitimate. And history tells us what happens when speech is silenced, whether by governmental decree, by cultural mobs, or by the barrel of a gun. In Nazi Germany, censorship and propaganda didn't just accompany violence, they prepared the ground for it. In Stalin's Russia, speech not only controlled, but criminalized, and millions paid with their lives. In Mao's China, dissent was eradicated in the name of harmony, but the result was mass conformity and suffering. Each of these regimes proved what Mill, Spinoza, and the framers of the UDHR all understood. When you shut down words, you eventually unleash violence. Mill reminded us that silencing even one human voice robs all of humanity of truth. Spinoza warned us that governments can control actions, but when they try to control minds, they become tyrannies. Garton Ash tells us that free expression is how we realize our full humanity. Peterson insisted that if you cannot risk offending, you cannot even think. And Parrick tries to draw a line. He says when speech moves from critique to stigmatization, it erodes society. Charlie Kirk's death sits at the intersection of all these insights. It forces us to ask, did his words contribute to polarization? Did Biden's rhetoric against Trump radicalize the other side? And does celebrating the murder of a speaker reveal a culture that has abandoned the discipline of debate for the thrill of elimination?
What happened to Charlie Kirk was horrific and a tragedy. What happened to the state legislators in Minnesota, that is horrific. It is a tragedy. And there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The central premise of our democratic system is that we have to be able to disagree and have sometimes really contentious debates without resort to violence.
The lesson here is not that speech is harmless, because it isn't. Words can inflame, they can stigmatize, and they can dehumanize. But the lesson is also that the cure for bad speech is never silencing speech. It's more speech, better arguments, courageous rebuttals, open debate. Because when speech is driven underground, it metastasizes. And when speech is answered with bullets, democracy itself starts to crumble. So maybe the real question isn't whether Charlie Kirk was right or wrong, whether his ideas were brave or offensive. The real question is whether we can still live in a society where those ideas can be confronted with argument, not assassins. Whether we can preserve a culture that says, I will fight for my view, but I will not kill for it. I will challenge you, but I will not silence you. That's the warning of Charlie Kirk's death. And that's the challenge for us all. If we lose the principle of free speech, messy, maddening, often painful free speech, then we lose not just one freedom, but the foundation of every freedom. This feels like a turning point in history, and as we reflect on what happened, we should remember this. Freedom of speech is not a luxury. It's the air democracies breathe, and without it, we all suffocate. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video on Charlie Kirk, Trump, and the freedom of speech. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment on what you thought. It's one of the most important topics, but we want to bring you more like this moving forward, and we can only do it with your help. See you in the next one.